Hello Year 8, welcome to this lesson which you can hopefully see is all about Is Britain Racist? Looking at a brief history of racism in Britain and the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm sure many of you have been keeping up to date with this on social media and know all about it and what's triggered the latest wave of protests. And as you can see, even if you look at Google, you can see that our institutions are somewhat biased. So you see things like on Google, if you put white people stole my car, it says, did you mean black people stole your car? They've changed that since because they could see it was racist. And it's important to recognise right here at the beginning of this lesson that there is no difference between us, is there, other when people have different coloured skin. We still have the same ability to feel and think and learn and experience life, whether you're white or you're black or you're Christian or Jewish or you're gay or straight. Gender non-binary or not. And the basic things that I want to be able to go through today is, what is racism? What is a history of racism in Britain? Does racism still exist today? And what can we do to prevent racism continuing? So we'll turn through that. Just to review those key terms that we looked at last time, we looked at, if you remember, stereotype, which is, can you remember? Huh? Can ya? Believing all people of a group share the same trait, like for instance Italians are loud. Prejudice is prejudging someone based on the stereotype, and discrimination is treating someone different because of a prejudice. So hopefully you can see the differences between those. But it's important we define racism because it's something quite different. So whereas many people define racism as just a form of prejudice, racism is defined by Rennie Edo Lodge as a combination of power and racial prejudice. That is what equals racism. Because if someone doesn't have power, they can't actually discriminate against someone, if that makes sense. It's by using power that you can change how someone experiences life. So it's really important for racism to translate into discrimination. It needs to include a power difference. Otherwise, it would just be a racial prejudice. And it's really important that we look at that in this context of the Black Lives Matter movement, because white people on the whole have much more power than black people in our society, sadly, disproportionately so. Because white people predominantly hold positions of power in our institutions, in schools, in the police, in hospitals, and amongst politicians as well. And indeed, especially in the judiciary, so judges and lawyers and barristers and stuff, nearly all white, high majority of them are white. And it's nice to throw in this quote by this person, who I'm sure most of you know, is Nelson Mandela, he says, no one is born hating another person because of the colour of their skin, or his background, or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Beautiful quote there from Nelson Mandela. And it's true, isn't it? Well, I think it is anyway, that it is feels more comfortable and more natural to express a loving warmth to others than a harsh hatred, especially because of their skin or their background or their religion. So it's important as well, it's also massively important to look at the history of racism in the UK after the First World War, when people came to the UK in large numbers after they fought for Britain in the First World War. We had massive racial tension in this country. You can see there from these images, go back to African Negroes, keep Britain white, really extreme racism in the UK, which also included racism against Irish people. So quite often you'd see these signs in shops which would say no black, no Irish, no dogs. And that sort of segregated society is not something that just happened in the US. That was something that the UK was explicitly involved in. And we had race riots in this country, and there's an image from Brixton riots in the 1980s, which were fueled by racism, really. And people who had lived here and been born here and worked here and helped support Britain, who were people of colour, defending their right to be here, saying, yeah, we do have a right to be here, when racists marched through Brixton to try and intimidate people to leave this country. This is a picture of some people from the EDL, the English Defence League, which is understood to be a sort of new version of the National Front by most people. So the National Front was a very racist organisation in the late part of the 20th century, last century, where there were lots of racists organised to try and make Britain white. And the EDL are understood mainly to be a very racist organisation, really, that promotes a white Britain. And when they say Britain first, often they mean white British people. And of course, we'll talk about this a bit later as well. Racism also caused in 2011, many people would argue, the London riots, or at least was a contributing factor because of the death of Mark Duggan. But really, this last sort of wave of awareness about racism all over the world in the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the death of this man, George Floyd, who was arrested and was very claustrophobic, really didn't like being in the back of a police car, and a police officer knelt on his neck to restrain him for 8 minutes and 48 seconds, and he suffocated. And his last words were, I can't breathe, which he said over and over again. And he was ignored by that police officer and a number of other police officers. And his death sparked a global movement, or at least gave more life to the Black Lives Movement, which already existed, to really try and bring into awareness that all lives matter, yes, of course, but it is black lives that are mostly suffering at the hands of institutions at the moment, whether that's the police force or education, or indeed, as we've seen with coronavirus, people of colour are much more likely to be to die in hospitals than people who are white. They seem to be treated less well and taken less seriously by doctors. And it's important that we remember the history of racism in this country in order that we can unpick these prejudices. And the reason that these protests have been, are so extreme, as some people have called them, is because black people have been campaigning for generations for equality, genuine equality, and that simply has not happened. We still have extremely entrenched racist ideas in our institutions that are not going to go away overnight, and it takes work to unpick those prejudices. So how did people of colour arrive in Britain? When we hear this thing, go home, when racist people say that, it's really important to recognise that black people have always been in the UK, as far back as we have records. And there were people of colour in the UK when the Romans arrived. So there had already been here until human life evolved in Africa. So, it's very reasonable to think that black people got to these islands before white people did, in which case perhaps we should say white people go home. Maybe white people should go back to Scandinavia and stuff, I don't know. There have been a couple of large influxes of people of colour since World War I. World War I, Britain forced members of its colonies to fight as well as British people, and the Empire enlisted people from all over the world, including 1 million Indian soldiers. They were treated terribly. The lowest ranking white soldier was higher than the highest ranking Indian officer. They were given shocking jobs. Around 74,000 Indian soldiers died, and they were promised independence from British rule in exchange for fighting, which Britain did not give them. So Britain lied to them. And we've got to ask ourselves, why did British politicians feel like that was okay to lie to all of these people? And a massive part of that has to be the entrenched idea that white people were cleverer than people of colour, brown skin or black skin, and that therefore white people had sort of a duty to civilise and to educate the savagery of people who weren't white. Also, people from the Caribbean fought for Britain. 200 died, mostly doing gruelling manual labour, so really, really horrible ways to die. Lots of those Indians as well died building bridges for the British Army, drowning in rivers under heavy equipment, or trying to build bridges under heavy enemy fire, which no white soldiers wanted to do. Really horrible work. And when Caribbean soldiers didn't receive a pay rise that most white people did, there was a rebellion, and one of them was shot, and they were brutally treated by the British. So that's a little bit of the history of racism in terms of the influx of people of colour into this country after the First World War. But it's important to recognise black people have always been in this country, and if we start trying to tell people to go home, as you sometimes see on placards and in certain newspapers, it's a ridiculous thing to say, because we are all mixed. All scientific evidence points to all human beings being around long enough that our DNA is mixed. And if we look at the selected history of racism in Britain, we can see the problem is old. So slavery existed between 1562 and 1833. That's 200, but nearly 300 years of slavery, and it existed longer than it hasn't. Then you had this idea of scientific racism, which we'll look at in more detail. The Holocaust, of course, the Nazis killed 9 million people, Jews, people of colour, gypsies, on racial grounds. The UK Race Relations Act was passed in 1965 to try and balance out and bring some law to prevent discrimination against people of colour. It wasn't enough, because in 1976 they had to pass a second one. And these were laws which tried to ensure that people were treated fairly at work, that they were treated fairly by police. But still racist sentiments bubble up. In 1998, Damilola Taylor, a young school lad who was 12, was stabbed to death near his home in London, in South London. And he bled to death. He was killed by a group of white people. And the police just did an absolutely shocking job of investigating that crime. And the people who did it were free for years. The Equality Act in 2010, again trying to make equality the law and to try and break through hundreds of years, thousands of years even, of racial prejudice. In 2018, the Windrush scandal. This is shocking. So after the Second World War, loads of people came to the UK from the Caribbean to help the UK get back on its feet, because we had lost so many people in the war. So Afro-Caribbean people drove our buses. They looked after people in the NHS as nurses. They ran our tubes, they ran our trains. You know, it's like really, really important infrastructure work. And when those people in 2018 who thought that they had contributed to the UK, as indeed most people do, the government sent those people a letter saying you're not welcome here anymore because you don't have the right documents. Absolutely shocking. The Windrush generation. And the race pay gap, still in 2019, is estimated to be £3.2 billion. It's a very selected history. It's important to acknowledge that we have made some progress, I think, in our understanding of racial equality, but there's still a lot more to do. And it's not just with people of colour either. This is a graph of anti-Semitic incidents, which is racist incidents against Jewish people. It's important to recognise that racism is still going on against many races in the UK, and that it's all of our duty to be anti-racist and to do what we can to make sure that it stops. So, let's look a little bit in more detail at slavery. So between 1562 and 1833, it was legal to buy and sell people of colour, especially African people, as we today buy and sell cattle or sheep. This was using human beings as objects. This was using human beings as a way to make profit. You can see this image, which is a very famous image, where all of these human beings are crammed together. You can see there that that bottom image is the lower deck, and then there was a group of people who were shoulder to shoulder. They'd have to be in these ships for 3 months. They'd not be let out to go to the toilet. Dead bodies were left to rot. The conditions were literally a living hell. I mean, it was absolutely horrendous. Many people died on the journey. An estimated 11 million people were transported in this way, which is 5 times the population of Greater Manchester, just to put that in perspective. sold as objects in tax. They were insured. There were insurance claims made. Sometimes slavers would throw slaves overboard in order to claim the insurance money. And you can really see that these racist ideas, where people were treated as objects, as you can see in that picture with a white man inspecting a slave, has caused just a massive amount of damage. Has to be at least as bad as the Holocaust. Really, really shocking for 270 years. And you can see here the trade triangle, the slave triangle. So what happened is ships would take processed materials to Africa, exchange those for slaves. The slaves would go to the Caribbean, where they would grow cotton and tobacco and sugar mainly. Then those goods would be transported back to the UK and processed in factories, and then sold and then taken down to Africa. And people made their millions in that way. And how did people justify that? Well, they justified it by telling themselves that black people were like animals, that they were dirty and stupid, and that they didn't understand life in the same way that white people did, and that they weren't capable of experiencing life as white people did. And that, what's really important, I really want you to be able to get from this weird bit of online learning, is that that doesn't just disappear. If that's been going on for hundreds of years, and even just in the 1950s and 60s, these adverts were produced where we had segregation in the United States and the UK, where black people were over there, white people were over here. It takes a long time to get those ideas out of the way we have built society. Okay, an individual might be able to think about it in new ways, but if the whole society is telling you how to think a certain way for your whole life, it's hard to see when that is right in front of your face all the time. It's like asking a fish what's water. The fish will be like, I don't know what water is, because the fish lives in water the whole time, right? We have lived in a context of racism. If you think about how the media portrays black people, and the history of slavery, and so many things, to actually, you have to be actively engaged in taking apart your racist prejudices. I do too, because they are very much embedded in our society. And this idea of anthropological scientific racism was produced in 1863, which stated that the Negro is inferior intellectually to the European and can only be humanized and civilized by Europeans. These were people who were considered scientists. And those racist ideas fed into Hitler's racist hierarchy, which he called eugenics, which had a specific scientific racial hierarchy, which you can see laid out in that image. Churchill was also an anti-Semite. This hatred of Jewish people was not just Hitler's, it was all over Europe. And it's just really important we stay awake and aware and cautious of the rise of these racist poisons in our society. So I want to talk a little bit about a few case studies. This is hard to this is hard to deal with. I'm going to tell you the story of Joy Gardner. It's really important we look at this, because it's important we remember that the UK is in many ways just as in a bad situation as the US with our history and treatment of black people. So Joy arrived in the UK in 1987. She had a 6 months tourist visa, which she overstayed, and she was forcefully deported for overstaying. So this was in 1993. Her house was raided in the early hours of the morning. She was restrained with handcuffs and leather straps, and she had 13-foot adhesive tape wrapped around her head. Now, she couldn't breathe properly, which she tried to tell them, and she collapsed and suffered extreme brain damage, and later died due to the damage caused by asphyxia, or lack of oxygen in the blood. She was placed on life support, but she died. 3 of the police officers involved stood trial for her manslaughter, but were not charged. So no one was charged in the murder or manslaughter of this woman, and it was not reported in any major newspaper. If a white middle-class woman had been treated in that way, that would have been all over the headlines. For the police to suffocate somebody for overstaying a visa. Just think about the massive injustice of that, and that no one was punished. No one was punished for it at all. Another example is this case of a man called Shiji Lapite in 1994. He was a Nigerian man who also died from asphyxiation, which is not being able to breathe properly, in the back of a police van. So this was in 1994. He was a Nigerian asylum seeker who was denied the right to stay in this country, and he was found to have been unlawfully killed. And after re-examining evidence, CPS upheld its original decision that no action would be brought. So this is a really interesting point, that in our current system of policing, something can be acknowledged as an unlawful killing, so they shouldn't have died, that was essentially murder, but at the same time as the murder, no action will be brought against the police officers. So, because it's, as you can see, a spokesman said, in the absence of evidence to show that the actions of the police officers, either singly or in concert, were a substantial cause, there is no realistic prospect of conviction. That man died in their care after being treated, after being manhandled into that van. And one of them admitted kicking him in the head. He was found to have 45 injuries. Died after being held in a neck hold. So we've got to ask ourselves, how is it that the police are not prosecuting their officers for treating human beings like this? And one of the reasons that we need to look at is that the CPS, which is the investigative service that looks at the police's behaviour, itself is run by the police and police ex-officers. So there's no independent scrutiny to make sure the police are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And a more personal example, a case of Anthony Walker in 2005. He was waiting at a bus stop, was attacked by some men, and they used a mountaineering axe to kill him, and he was 17 years old. And they did that for no reason other than the fact that he was a young black man. So that's in 2005. This is recent. This is all really recent. And it's important, as I hope you're getting to grips, to understand that racism is still alive and well in the UK, in our institutions and in our communities as well. And that being against being non-racist is not really enough in such a situation. What the Black Lives Matter movement are calling for is for everyone to be actively anti-racist, because we need to challenge these prejudices that I keep going on about. Last one, the case of Bijan Ibrahimi in 2017, just 3 years ago. He had asked for help from police officers for a number of times over the course of 7 years. He was an Iranian refugee, so he was a Christian Iranian who fled Iran because of the way Iran treats Christians, which is another horrible story that I won't go into. People claimed that he was a paedophile falsely, his neighbours did, and they targeted him, and eventually his neighbour killed him, and the police simply did not help. He would call them regularly to express fear for his life, and out of neglect the police failed him, and he died because of it. And we have to ask ourselves this question again, don't we? Would the police have ignored a middle-class white person asking for help in the same way that they ignored a disabled Iranian refugee? I doubt it. So those are the case studies that I wanted to show you. And it's also important to look in a little bit more detail at the structural racism. So the structures that we've built in our institutions are indeed racist. So the most powerful elite in this country is 97% white. And you can see that at work, injustice in shops, going out and travel, people of colour experience racism a lot in this country. They experience it a lot. And this isn't just in one walk of life either. As I say, there's a £3.2 billion pay gap for people of black, Asian and ethnic minority workers. BAME, that's what BAME stands for, black and minority ethnic. And that in the police, this racial disparity is seen even more. So from admitted questionnaires, 10.5% of white people have admitted to using drugs, where it's just 5.8% of black people, whereas black people are 6 times more likely to be searched by police than white people. So we have to ask ourselves, why that is. Why are black people being assumed by police to be more likely to have drugs and be committing crime? That prejudice combined with power is racism. We also have this shocking statistic that in 13 years, between 1991 and 2014, 509 people of colour have died in police custody in the UK under suspicious circumstances. There have been no prosecutions. Not one. And you can see that 52% of those who died in custody were black, 30% Asian. Just a tiny proportion were white. So just to drive that point home, the proportion of BAME deaths in custody where restraint is a feature is over 2 times greater than it is in other deaths. So that's where restraint is actively used before somebody dies. BME deaths in custody where use of force is a feature over 2 times greater than other deaths. Mental health related issues are a feature nearly 2 times greater than other deaths. So we can see that black people are treated more forcefully by police, are restrained more often, and suffer more extreme mental health conditions in police custody. Really important. Mark Duggan was a man who police thought was carrying a gun, and he was shot in London. There was a lot of suspicious circumstances around whether there was a gun or not. You can watch that on the documentary. Mark Duggan's family were not informed of his death by police. They heard about it through the community. And so his family and friends of the family went to their local police station to ask them what had happened to their son. The police did not respond to his family for 3 days. So on the 3rd day, this had gradually got worse and worse. So there was the family and there was extended family and friends of the family. And so it was quite a big group of people outside this police station. And eventually that frustration overspilled until somebody turned over to set a car on fire. And that sparked the London riots in 2011, which then spread all over the country, in Bristol and Manchester, which was essentially down to the police refusing to speak to a family about the fact that they killed their son. And would that have happened with a white family? We have to ask that question. I don't think so. I don't think so. So all that is to say that we have as much of a problem with racism in the UK as we do in the US. And I hope it brings there's more detail there for you to understand the Black Lives Matter movement and why it is so important that we understand that it is not enough to be non-racist. We need to be anti-racist. We need to find where racism is in our society and in ourselves, really importantly, because this sort of social conditioning, if you like, this education that goes on about black people and white people, about the images we receive of people of colour compared to white people in our media, and how that conditions our mind from a very young age, as you saw from the Dole test in the last lesson. We need to actively participate in unpicking racism, as if you're a white middle class person like me, or a white person, and that if you are a person of colour, I wouldn't deign to give you advice on what to do, but to educate yourself, especially on your rights in regards to police and stop and search and stuff like that, what police are and are not allowed to do, and to be part of the change. In the US, you can see the problem is obvious in the media. The US locks up more people than anyone else in the world, and the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, so the chance that somebody in their lifetime will spend some time in prison, is 1 in 3 if you're a black male, and 1 in 17 if you're a white male, 1 in 18 if you're a black female, 1 in 11 if you're a white female. So it's the issue is really bad. It's really bad, the institutionalized racism. And it's important to see that these protests have been having some really significantly positive results. So Minneapolis has committed to dismantling its police force, defunding its police, and putting that funding into schools, into social projects, and to help alleviate the symptoms of poverty, and a more restorative justice approach rather than a punitive punishing justice system, one which helps people, helps understand the problems of why people commit crime and lifting them out of it. Big reforms pledged in New York City. Statues of slave owners and known racists have been taken down worldwide as a result of these protests. Big public figures like the co-founder of Reddit has resigned to make room for a black candidate. There's a database being set up to record police brutality. Police have been held account as never before for racism all over the US, with officers for the first time, not for the first time, but much more commonly being convicted and tried of racist crimes and fired as well. And this is a list of accomplishments from the Black Lives Matter movement. You can see 4 officers fired for murdering George Floyd. It's Maramed.com have this open source list. The mayors agreeing not to renew live police force contracts. So these are big changes that are happening on governmental and local levels, and you can see the loads and loads of changes that have come because of protests, and they do work, you know, in bringing our awareness forward about how we need to be anti-racist. So your chapter, Is Britain Still Racist? You need to include a definition of racism, a brief history of racism in Britain. You can choose some of the things that I've talked about, or do your own research. Be my guest. An explanation of the Black Lives Matter movement and what you think could or should be done to counteract racism in Britain. And of course, it's really important. You know, some people, it's important to address in this video the thing that people say, well, all lives matter. Yeah, well, yeah, of course, all lives do matter, but white people are not facing the level of police brutality that people of colour are. The level of some of those statistics that I've showed you about, black people are much more likely to be searched by police, much more likely to die in police custody, much more likely for their killers to not face any repercussions. So we need to bring a torchlight onto the main issue with race at the moment, the main people who are suffering, which are people of colour, not white people. So last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play you this video from Prince EA. I know some of you like him, some of you not so much. And I hope it gives you some inspiration on what you might want to do in terms of thinking about how you might act to be against racism. Could be something as epic as this video, but Prince EA has a whole production team. I would recommend doing something smaller, maybe a small gesture, a photo on your social media feeds, or just speaking to your family about it and having good conversations about racism.
I am not black. I mean, that's what the world calls me, but it's not me. I didn't come out of my mother's womb saying, hey everybody, I'm black. No, I was taught to be black, and you were taught to call me that, along with whatever you call yourself. It's just a label. See, from birth, the world force feeds us these labels, and eventually we all swallow them.
So I hope you enjoyed that little video, nice and cheesy ending. Nice reminder that the labels of our race are just that, invented by human beings in human systems, and that we can, of course, change that. There is a reminder of what I'd like you to include in your booklet. Thank you very much for sticking with this lesson. Respect you for watching it. I'd like you, if you like, to do an Able and Talented extension, which is to create a short 2 to 3 minute piece of media explaining to your own friends and family what the Black Lives Matter movement is and why it's important. Doesn't need to be nearly as well produced as that Prince EA video. He's got a whole staff and, a bunch of actors to pay and stuff like that. So it could be, and simple is often just as powerful as anything else. Could be a video, an animation, a recording, a song, a poem, a rap, anything you like. Something that helps explain what the Black Lives Matter movement is to your friends and your family. I will put a couple of these documentary links in the description and you can check them out in your own time if you would like to. There's the Lawful Killing of Mark Duggan documentary, which I mentioned before, and a few programmes about If Britain is Still Racist, and The Secret Lives of Britain's Slave Owners. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope that's interesting. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to email me on your school email. And I look forward to seeing you all. Be well, stay well, go well. Goodbye.